Greetings all, Ferrari Man 601 here. With the recent passing of former world champion Niki Lauda, I thought that perhaps it would be appropriate for us to take an in-depth look in Assetto Corsa of the car that won him his first Formula One World Championship, the 1975 Ferrari 312T. Of course, Niki Lauda, being the legend, absolute giant that he was, not only in sport, but in business, in politics, basically everything that this man did turned to gold simply on account of his sheer willpower and adept skill in many different areas. He created legends that were just as big as himself in many cases, and we saw this all throughout his entire career, no matter what he did, whether it was racing or the airline industry or in management, driver management, and later in his life team management, most recently with Mercedes. Everything that Niki Lauda did seemed to turn to gold. Such is the case with this particular car, the Ferrari 312T. It's somewhat of a forgotten car in terms of what it has actually managed to achieve in the course of its career. Of course, now in the last 40 years or so, it has been nothing more than a museum piece. But since Assetto Corsa's inception, it had a little bit of a revival coming into sim racing, and of course, Kunos doing the fantastic job that they always do with their software and with the cars that they choose to include in their software. They brought it back to life, very much so, and sim racers all around the world get the chance to play with the 312. Let's talk a little bit about what this car is, why it came to be such a good car, and of course, later on, we're going to drive it. The Ferrari 312T, of course, it is a Formula One car designed and built by Ferrari for the purposes of competing in, initially, the 1975 Formula One World Championship. It was designed by none other than another legend of Formula One history, Mauro Forghieri. Forghieri, of course, he was the Ferrari team manager and the chief designer for many years under the direct supervision of Mr. Ferrari himself. So, right away, we have some very awesome provenance going on with this car. The immediate predecessor to the 312T was the 312B3, which was not a very successful car, so Forghieri had some work to do. Its immediate successor was the 126C. Of course, this was going into 1981, coming into the dawn of the turbo era, as it later evolved to become. Yes, this car, a 1975 car, but it remained relevant all the way through 1980. Remember, these are the days before Formula One teams had the absolutely astronomical budgets that we see nowadays. Of course, Ferrari, being the oldest and most moneyed team, of course they had a lot of resources, money-wise and otherwise, even in this era, but team budgets were not quite to the level of ridiculousness that we see nowadays. So many teams up and down the grid, they did use the same cars for several seasons at a clip. Ferrari, no different in that regard. The 312T raced in some version from 1975 all the way through 1980. Therefore, it has quite a long competition history. The design of the car itself, it's very conventional relative to what we saw in this era. Remember, this is before the carbon revolution overtook Formula One. Of course, McLaren pioneering carbon composites in 1981 with their MP41 chassis. So this car features aluminum construction. Yes, it is still a monocoque, being that we have the main chassis of the car being fashioned in pretty much one piece, as the term monocoque would suggest, but it is aluminum. There is no carbon on this car anywhere. Carbon composites had not yet made their way into automotive design, at least not in Formula One. Suspension. At the front, we have a double wishbone spring arrangement. We do not have push rods per se in this era. More or less, we have what you would see on most road cars even today, with a double wishbone or double control arm, double A arm, if you're more familiar with that terminology, mounting a vertically mounted spring damper. So again, take the wheel off of your road car and you're going to see something that looks more or less like what we're going to see on this Formula One car. At the rear, pretty much the same arrangement. It's a double wishbone damper arrangement, vertically mounted dampers again, but there is a little bit of a multi-link array going on the rear as well, but still extremely conventional even by modern road car standards happening here in 1975 for Ferrari. Powering this car, the Ferrari Type 015 2,992 cubic centimeter flat 12. Yes, we have a flat 12-cylinder engine, horizontally opposed at 180 degrees, making the flat or boxer block, developing about 500 horsepower here. Naturally aspirated, of course. This was before turbocharging took hold in Formula One, so all the induction pressure is happening from the atmosphere and the atmosphere only. Again, about 500 horsepower. The gearbox in this car, and this actually is what gives the car the T designation in its name. It is a 5-speed H-pattern manual mounted transversely. The reason why they've done this is they want to try and minimize the amount of real estate that the gearbox takes up in the rear zone of this car. And when we take a look at the rear zone, you'll see how compact everything is. That is 100% owed to the transverse mounting configuration of that gearbox, hence the T designation, transversale, transverse, 312T in the car's name. Tires come to us from Goodyear, and that's about it in terms of the in and out technical specifications on this car. Competition history, though, it is quite storied and quite long, as we have alluded to previously. The car, of course, made its debut in 1975, and it remained relevant all the way through 1980, ultimately in the 312T5 configuration. The car went through several different changes in its macrocosmic configuration. It was that adaptable of an initial platform, so it was relevant for 5 years. It was driven by Niki Lauda, Clay Regazzoni, Gilles Villeneuve, Carlos Reutemann, and Jody Scheckter. So we have some very noteworthy characters getting behind the wheel of this 312. The car made its debut at the 1975 South African Grand Prix, and its last debut was the 1980 Argentine Grand Prix, meaning that over its entire 5 years in Formula One, it started 90 races, it took victory in 27 of them, it scored 61 total podium finishes, 19 pole positions, and 25 fastest laps. Name me another Formula One car in the last 40 years that has that sort of a competition history, just in terms of sheer numbers of races contested. Championships, yep, this car definitely won quite a few of them. The Constructors' Championship, this car won 4 of them in 1975, 1976, 1977, and 1979. Drivers' Championships, this car took home 3. 2 of them for Niki Lauda in 1975 and 1977, and 1 by Jody Scheckter in 1979. So for a car that was racing for 5 years, winning the Constructors' Championship in 4 of those 5 years is very noteworthy, I must say, and winning the Drivers' Championship in 3 of those 5 years, again, quite noteworthy as well. You will not find too many other race cars that have that sort of a record out of 90 races, winning 27 of them. That is pretty good of a hit rate if you ask me. Regardless, what we do have here overall in terms of the driving experience, and we'll talk about this more once we do drive the car, it's quite different from what you're going to get in 2019 with the very high horsepower, very high downforce, very high mechanical grip type of Formula One car that we have today. It's all back to basics with this thing, and I've got to say I do very much enjoy when we get the opportunity to do things like that, because it is very raw, it's very unfinished, it's very visceral, it's very much seat of the pants. You're not relying on the computers to help you out because this car doesn't have any computers, quite simply. It's all done by feel, experience, and bravery. And certainly, the guys who drove this car had no shortage of bravery. Taking a closer look here in terms of what Kunos gave us in the modeling of this car, here's the rear end that we talked about previously. Just take a look at how compact everything is. Just looking at it across the rear axle here, you can see the car pretty much stops at the rear axle. That is entirely down to the transverse placement of the gearbox, as we talked about prior. You can see the gearbox casing here. It's facing in pretty much 90 degrees to the wrong direction from where you'd expect to see the gearbox casing in a modern car. That's because it is displaced by 90 degrees. It's mounted transversely. Of course, it'd be geared to the engine, which is mounted longitudinally using a bit of a bevel gear setup there. Of course, that would also be dictating a little bit, at least, of your final drive ratio, I would imagine. But very nice packaging, and we don't really see transverse anything in Formula One cars anymore. Nowadays, the designs have become so prescribed that we always have longitudinal engines and we always have longitudinal gearboxes, and that's partially what owes to the very long wheelbases that we see nowadays. But in these days, the rationale was keep the car short. Keep the car as short as possible in terms of the wheelbase because you want it to be maneuverable. A short wheelbase does tend to make cars a little bit twitchy, but the trade-off is you've got these really huge tires on these things, so they have no shortage of grip as far as the mechanical side of things is concerned. But as well, we talked about the suspension arrangement there. We can see the right rear here. You can see that we have upper and lower wishbones here, but we do have a little bit of a multi-link situation that's starting to develop. You can see across the top section of the rear zone, we have a torsion bar, and we have the vertically mounted spring dampers, more or less a McPherson sort of damper mounted here in the rear zone of this car. That's what it was, and you can take a look at basically any kind of a car, but we'll stick to Formula One here. Take a look at the Lotus Type 25, Lotus Type 49, for example, and you'll see effectively the same suspension arrangement going on. So in terms of design of dampers and suspension configurations in general, we really didn't see too much of a departure from this until the carbon monocoque started to come in the early 80s, and they started to get a little bit more creative in terms of damper placement and ultimately the types of dampers, and ultimately, if we're talking about Williams in 92 and 93, the deletion of dampers via active suspension and managing all of these forces with hydraulic pressure rather than mechanical spring tension. But this is what it was in the mid-70s, and, well, it was quite effective. There was basically no other way to make an automotive suspension in this era, and, well, I say it's pretty cool. Coming out the sides of the gearbox here, there is the half shafts there with the CV boots there, joining them up with the wheel hubs, delivering the torque and all your drive power to the rear axle. Very nice. You'll also note we have the brake discs mounted inboard here. We have two ducts that are coming down from the topside bodywork immediately into the brake discs. That's just to cool the brakes. That's also to minimize what's called unsprung weight. If you have the more mass that is outboard of the dampers, you see the dampers on this car, they're mounted fairly far outboard, not in the wheel hubs, but pretty close to the wheel hubs. Anything that is outboard of the dampers is called unsprung weight, meaning that it is outside the imaginary box that you get if you draw two vertical lines up from the tops of the dampers. And unsprung weight, it's basically free mass that's just hanging out on the periphery. And what it can tend to do is, if you have too much of it, it's a little bit uncontrollable. It can raise the center of gravity of a car. If you get the car into extreme dynamic situations, let's say you get the tail end out, as happens quite frequently in cars like these, you get more inertia that is not able to be countered by the suspension action, which means that things can get out of control. So ultimately, teams want to minimize unsprung weight. That's one of the reasons why the brake discs, very heavy individual components, and of course in this era they're made out of steel, much like you would get on road cars today. They're heavy, they want to place them inboard of the damper, so rather than placing them inside the wheels like you would get in a more conventional type of car, they want to place them inboard, right on the sides of the gearbox here, and notice they are within the boundaries of the dampers. So that is no longer unsprung weight, that is now sprung weight, meaning that the dynamic loading induced by that mass can now be picked up by the suspension more readily and more easily controlled, ultimately making the car faster around the corners. Because this is racing after all. Coming along to the midsection of the car, you can see very smooth, very quiet. The teams were starting to get a handle on aerodynamics in this era. Remember, at the beginning of the 70s, the cars had really only just started to sprout wings. So aerodynamics in terms of race car design, It's still a little bit in its infancy here. I think we're approaching adolescence because we can see now that we have two very appreciable wing structures, front and rear wings, in more or less the conventional locations that we would still expect to see them. So we're starting to get more modern in terms of what we see nowadays, but the wings themselves are very rudimentary. You can see the front wing here. It is just a single main plane, and it is flat all the way across. You can see that the actual shape of the wing itself, that's all pressed into the aluminum bodywork that makes up the wing. We see end fences here, but they're very small, and they're basically only there to keep the wing from flexing too much. They don't do much in terms of trying to steer air around. They're not creating outwash by any stretch of the imagination here like we see in modern Formula One. It's just there. They're trying to create a little bit of downforce across the front axle, and that's what they're doing with that wing and nothing more. Also notice that the nose tip of this car doesn't really exist. Yes, it has a nose tip, obviously, because it doesn't extend into infinity, but it's just this rectangular flat section that's sort of sticking out there, and then the wing's mounted on top of it. Very cool, and very interesting, and very not something we would see today. Pulling in closer a little bit, you can see the dampers of the front suspension, almost the same as what they're doing on the rear. You can see that we do have the upper and lower wishbones, and of course the tie rods for the steering rack, as you can see in there, and then we've got our dampers mounted inboard right underneath that front end bodywork. It's functional and nothing more, and again, it doesn't look all that much different from what you'd see on road cars today. Top side, all of this bodywork that you can see where the Ferrari Shield logos are, the Tag Heuer sponsorship, and of course Niki Lauda's name across the midsection there, that is all removable. There's no structure in this section of the car. It's merely there to give the driver a false sense of security in terms of being protected from anything. All of that would be removable. The engine cover as well is integrated in all of that. So the topside bodywork on this car, it's basically just for show and for a little bit of aero efficiency and for, again, a little bit of false security giving to the drivers. It would all be removed in one piece for easy access to everything. In this era, the drivers did not sit inside the cars as much as they sat on top of them, and you can definitely get a sense of that here. In terms of the fuel situation, well, taking a look at the cockpit here, you can see that we have these two very large bulkheads to either side. Those are the fuel tanks, my friends. So the driver is sitting in between about 200 liters of high-octane racing gasoline. So again, we're not talking about a very safe situation, and unfortunately and legendarily, Niki Lauda found out all about that in 1976 at the Nürburgring when he had that massive fire. These guys were gladiators, and it's part of the reason why people like Niki Lauda became such legends, because they knew what tremendous risks that they were taking, and, well, unfortunately for Niki Lauda, it didn't turn out so well on that particular day, but obviously he went on to make pretty much a full recovery and even to win another 2 world championships after that. Coming back into the cockpit now, here's where things get very stark if we're going to compare them to the present day. In the cockpit, we're sitting way high in terms of the position that we'll have when we drive the car, but there's our gear lever there, 5-speed plus reverse. The gate is a dog leg, so first gear is back and toward you, where you'd expect second gear to be on most road car gearboxes. And then, of course, the gate goes all the way up to fifth. Lockout on reverse that you can see there. There would be a little pin that the driver would pull so that he could push the stick left and forward to engage reverse. And again, that lockout is there so he doesn't accidentally throw it into reverse as he's going for what would be second gear on the 1-2 upshift there. That dogleg first gear. Going down in the cockpit, seatbelts, pretty much where you'd expect to see them today. I'm not entirely sure if they were quite as effective as the restraint systems that we have today, but they look pretty conventional as far as we're concerned in 2019. And then across the rest of the cockpit, absent are any semblances of headrests or any kind of cockpit protection at all. Certainly the idea of having devices like Halo or Aero Screen or anything of those sorts, not even a figment of the imagination in this era. These cars were designed to be as lightweight as possible, as small as possible. The driver, mainly, he only existed as a part of the mechanical setup of the car because the car couldn't be autonomous. Somebody with a little bit of craziness upstairs needed to sit in here and drive the thing as fast as possible. So minimal accommodations made for the drivers in this era, but such was life for everybody. Also on the dashboard here, if you could even call it that, it's kind of just a little panel stuck there as an afterthought. We have got water temperature on the left, tachometer front and center, and then we have oil temperature and oil pressure there on the right. Flat 12 engine, as we mentioned, in this 1975 specification, it revs to about 12,000 RPM, putting out about 500 horsepower right up there at 12,000 RPM. If you over-rev the engine, it blows up, and if you don't rev it high enough, you're too slow. Such was life in this era. They weren't so concerned with things like fuel saving. They did not refuel in this era. Refueling, as we came to know it, really hadn't been invented yet. But, again, 200 liters of gas on board. The engines were not frugal by any means, but, again, manual shifting, a lot of engine braking going on, particularly as you're coming down through the gearbox, unsynchronized gearboxes, remember, so lots of heel-toe action going on. They were just very different. Also notice, you don't really have any buttons in here. Steering wheel, you could put this in any road car and I don't think you'd be left wanting for anything. Put this in a 2019 spec F1 car, the drivers would be utterly lost, I'm led to believe. So again, changes in terms of then versus now, but if I had to have a choice in terms of what kind of car I would like to drive, it would be something more along these lines rather than the modern ones, simply because I can identify with these. I can get in my own road car and get a sense of the sorts of techniques that these drivers would have had to be using, because they're not all that different, all things considered. So, again, food for thought, perhaps, but such is life in Formula One. The sport never stands still, pun intended, but every day something changes on a Formula One car. A team figures out a little detail that they can do a little bit better, or they analyze some data and they say, hey, we're losing time here. Can we change this? And perhaps we'll pick up half a tenth someplace, maybe, hypothetically. With the sorts of development money that they have today, they are able to bring an entirely new specification to every race if they wanted. The regulations don't really allow that anymore, but in this era, it was still a little bit seat-of-your-pants improvisation, and of course, a lot of driving talent ultimately decided the fate of many a Grand Prix. Speaking of the places where these Grands Prix were contested, we do have many circuits that we still visit today that featured on the 1975 calendar, namely places like Silverstone, Spa, Monaco, places like that. But one place in particular that really became associated with not only the 312T but Niki Lauda as well was the Nürburgring Nordschleife. The Nordschleife was basically the only version of the Nürburgring that existed at that time, and of course it was host to the German Grand Prix. Yes, the entire 20-kilometer Nordschleife. Because we're doing this with an undercurrent of remembering the giant that Niki Lauda was, we've got to take this car to the Nordschleife and perhaps just get a little taste of an idea of what it might have been like to drive this thing in anger around one of the most demanding, longest, dangerous, technically challenging circuits that the world has ever known. We will see you at the Nürburgring next. Welcome to the Nordschleife. Before we get out on track, of course, a look through the setup screen to show you what's going on with this Ferrari 312T. On the gear screen, of course, we have our gearbox first through fifth gear. That's how far back in time we're going here. Manual shift it yourself H pattern. Best gearbox ever, the 5-speed manual. But anyway, all 5 ratios are adjustable to your heart's content, as is the final drive ratio. Tires, we have a choice of 2 tire compounds, the hard and soft GP70 from Kunos compound here. Tire pressure is default to 20 psi on the front axle and 19 on the rear. The range of adjustment goes from 9 to 25 psi. We'll keep that at default, thank you very much.
Fuel zeroed out here to keep the engine quiet. Maximum fuel capacity is 200 liters, as we mentioned. And again, we'll zero that to shut it down. Wings. Now, as we mentioned in show review, the wings here are little more than just shaped pieces of sheet metal to form a rough airfoil profile. They don't really do all that much. Certainly they do nothing in comparison to what the cars are currently capable of. But 3 degrees on the front and 6 degrees on the rear are the default values here. You can adjust the rear wing up to 10 degrees or take it all the way down to 0. The front wing goes down to 0 or all the way up to 7 if that's what you're looking for. Alignment, camber and toe on all 4 corners, default values are shown. Dampers, bound and rebound, no fast or slow adjustments here, just the raw bound and raw rebound on all 4 corners there. Drivetrain, differential, this is more or less conventional. Differential adjustments in power, coast, and preload, all at default. The generic settings, here's where we can play a little. Brake power is at 100%. It can go down to 80 if you so desire, but I like it pumped right up to the max. Brake bias defaults to 51%. The engine limiter, this is the rev limiter, defaults to 100. It goes down to 96, but we're going to peg it right up to the max at 108. The vinyl screen, suspension, anti-roll bars front and rear, as well as your wheel rates and ride heights on all 4 corners. Now, we're going to run this on the hard compound tires. We're going to take a little bit out of the pressures here. Run it at 18 all around. Fuel, we'll put about 80 liters on board, so that should be sufficient. We're not going to touch the wings, we're not going to touch the suspension, we're not going to touch the differential, and the engine limiter, of course, going up to 108. Now, in the cockpit of this car, now that everything's alive, well, you can see that we have basically no creature comforts. If we go into free cam for a moment, you can take a look around and, well, there's nothing. No padding, no headrest, no protection, no halo. There's the sky. Hello. But yeah, the cockpit, as we mentioned, it's just there to give the driver a bit of a false sense of security. If we go outside, you can see, yes, the driver is fairly nestled in here below most of that bodywork, but that bodywork does not have a structural role in the car. It's all removable, and it's all very thin fiberglass. So, yeah, it's not going to do anything to protect you. Again, it's there for sponsorship space rather than anything truly useful. And then, of course, we have the issue of this racetrack, the Nürburgring Nordschleife. It's enormous. It's over 20 kilometers long. It's one of the oldest racetracks in the world. It's one of the longest racetracks in the world. And it's one of the most technically demanding racetracks in the world. It is still the benchmark today for automobile manufacturers. They go here, they test their prototypes, no matter what they are. Hyundai comes here, they test new road cars. Koenigsegg comes here and they set new lap records. Porsche comes here with illegal race cars and blows the all-out lap record clear out of the water. It is the benchmark for what is cool in the automotive world. Of course, the Nürburgring has been off of the Formula One calendar for quite some time, at least the Nordschleife has, mostly because of, well, obviously we have big safety concerns here. It's so long, it's so dense, it's through thick forest, you have Armco barriers everywhere, you have basically no runoff through most of the corners, the speeds are high. The logistical challenge of trying to get marshals here through every corner, being able to respond to a driver in distress in a timely fashion, it's just not possible. So cooler heads prevailed and said, no, the Nordschleife goes away, but for the rest of the world, it's still very much alive, and there are still races that occur here on a yearly basis, including a couple of 24-hour races, which is also quite insane. The place is so huge that the weather could well be different on one side versus the other, meaning that if you've got some rain going on the backside of the track, you don't know what tires you should be on at the start. Yes, it's that crazy. But for our purposes here today, we don't have to worry about the weather. It's bright sunshine, ambient temperature about 15 C, and off we go in the Ferrari 312. Again, a fair bit of fuel on board. We've got the hard tires on board, so we'll have to get temperature into them. No tire blankets to speak of course. However, brakes, that's an interesting question. Steel brakes on these cars, remember, just like you get on most road cars still today. So heat is almost the enemy of steel brakes. They work best when their temperatures are on the lower side of the spectrum, so heat is kind of something that you control rather than try to build. They're not at all like carbon brakes. They also don't have nearly the stopping power of carbon brakes, so you're using the transmission. You're using a lot of engine braking also to help you slow this car down, meaning that your downshifts had better be on point. And of course, we're talking about an unsynchronized racing gearbox, so lots of heel toe and even some occasional double clutching happening in this thing. Up here, over the crest, here's Flugplatz. Flat out for a little while, but don't let it lull you into a false sense of security. We do not have much downforce at all. We don't have much mechanical grip, relatively speaking, at all. So you do have to know which way you're going. Coming down through the foxhole into 5th gear, even in a car this old, flat out through here. Lots of camber to help you, but immediately start thinking real hard about slowing this thing down because the track tightens up a ton. Into 1st gear. How many times does a Formula 1 car nowadays get into 1st gear over the course of a lap? Not too often. This thing, it's a must. This is flat, this is not. Really not with the hard tires. Coming up through Calenard now, coming down the hill. Bit of a braking zone, get on the power as quickly as you dare. The back end is going to step out. Now through this triple apex complex, 3 times right as is officially called. Coming down on the brakes, back into 1st gear, through here, on the power, 2nd gear. Let it drift a little. Oh, it's immense. It's absolutely immense, and we've not even done half a lap yet. And now, of course, we are coming up to the point on the circuit where, in 1976, in a slightly evolved version of this car, right here, where Niki Lauda had his absolutely horrifying accident. The car speared off to the left, hit the barriers, fuel tanks ruptured, it burst into flames. It was hit again by another car following closely behind. Niki found himself trapped in the smoldering remains of his car, fire all around him. His helmet had been ripped off in the initial impact. It was ill-fitting that particular day, leaving his face exposed to the full force of the fire. Niki probably would not have survived had it not been for the heroic efforts of his fellow competitors, stopping on their own accord to pull him out of what was left of the car, because of course he was trapped in there, unable to free himself, still conscious, mind you. They get him out. Niki remains conscious, help arrives, and then becomes a very long recovery process, of course. He suffered severe burns to his face, truly disfiguring injuries. He was administered last rites at the hospital. Their prognosis was not good. However, what would transpire next was an absolutely astronomical story of commitment and downright stubbornness on the part of Herr Lauda, because he'd be back racing just about 6 weeks later. But pulling away from that for a moment, let's look at what happened to Niki Lauda in context. Of course, in 1976, Niki Lauda was the reigning world champion, having won the title in 1975. Formula One, for better or worse, it always tends, the atmosphere, the overall ambiance, the overall complexion of a season, it tends to gravitate around the world champion, whoever it may be. Imagine what would happen today if somebody of the stature of, heaven forbid, Lewis Hamilton or Sebastian Vettel or Kimi Räikkönen, somebody who is either currently or is a former world champion still active, and something like that were to happen to them. The shock that it would send through the entire motor racing world, and of course through the Formula One paddock and the media corps and everybody else who follows the sport, it would be such a mortal blow to everything. Not only the morale, but the overall complexion of the entire sport would drastically change in an instant. That's what it had to have been like in 1976 when Niki Lauda had his accident. Suddenly realizing that the world champion, somebody who you universally accept as being larger than life, as being the best that there is right now, has something like that happen. And I'm sure the perspective that it must lend is just one of an utter acknowledgement of the fleeting temporality of everything. However, that's not what happened to Mr. Lauda. We mentioned that he was a tenacious character, and that he was about 6 weeks after suffering an accident that by most estimates should have killed him. And a couple of times he later in life talked about this in the very famous interview series, the Messenger interviews with Niki Lauda. If you haven't seen them, you need to see them. He talks about a few near-death experiences that he had, being able to watch his own soul basically slipping away from his grasp, and then his brain stepping in and saying, "No, you're dying, stay alive, this isn't what happens to you yet." But he came back and he finished the season, and he brought the championship fight right up to James Hunt, right up into the Japanese Grand Prix, which in that year was at Fuji. Again, another race that modern sensibilities would look at and say, there's no way that we should be having a motor race here, not in these conditions. It was atrociously wet. If you've seen the 2007 Japanese Grand Prix at Fuji, you get some sense of how wet it was on that day in 1976. It was so wet that even the 6-wheeled Tyrrells were having trouble staying on the road. But here they were having the Japanese Grand Prix, Niki Lauda out there in conditions that nobody should have been driving in, less a motor car like that. But you wouldn't even want to be walking outside in torrential rain like that, never mind driving around at a couple 100 miles an hour in a car that effectively is a rolling bomb. Incredible. Niki Lauda, of course, doing this, still nursing the still fresh wounds that he had suffered from the injuries that he experienced here at the Nürburgring, wherein his eyelids were destroyed by the fire. And that was the commitment that he had. Until one moment where he's out there and he's realizing, you know what? This is a little bit too crazy, even for me. It's not worth it. He withdrew from the race. James Hunt became the world champion. Probably it's the most famous climax to a world championship that we'll ever see. Yes, it's even above the Senna-Prost debacle in 1989 and 1990. It's insane. Absolutely crazy. And that's what Niki Lauda said. And that's why James Hunt became the world champion that year. But Niki had the last laugh. A year removed from what happened here at the Nürburgring, he won the championship again. And again, I know that you all know the story of Niki Lauda and who he was and the immense things that he did. Of course, even putting his racing career aside, had he not done half of the things that he did in sport, we would still look at somebody like him as incredibly accomplished. He kind of fudged his way through school. He did not like to be a student. It was not his thing. More power to him, quite honestly. The money that he earned from his racing enabled him to become quite the entrepreneur. He founded, I believe it's 3 airlines. He even did this during his racing career as well. He founded the eponymous Lauda Air, which still exists, at least as a subsidiary now of Ryanair, I believe it is. He became a fully certified commercial airline pilot. He even flew on very many of his Lauda Air flights, acting as captain or first officer. It was great for PR, he said, and of course, being a businessman, being the CEO of a company like that, there was no better way to get up close and personal with what the situation on the ground was in terms of what worked and what didn't. Later in life, of course, he went on to get back into motorsport. He returned to Formula One with McLaren, won the World Championship one more time in 1984, and then he stayed around in the paddock as a pundit for German television. And then, of course, some of his last accomplishments in life were being the non-executive chairman of Mercedes-Benz Motorsport, working hand-in-hand with guys like Toto Wolff and Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas and Nico Rosberg. And of course, they're still winning championships. It's not often that you get a talent like that. But for the moment, if we can put the man aside, what was his machine like? Well, as you can see here, we're being very conservative because, well, I have some content to produce for you, and I want to make it somewhat enjoyable to watch. Therefore, you don't particularly want to see somebody doing a Sebastian Vettel impersonation the whole time. You want to see it going at a reasonable clip around this place, which we are. However, there's a lot more in it. But in terms of what the car is like to drive, well, I'm sure many of you have driven it, and I'm sure many of you have been driving it in the last few days. However, it's what you would expect. It's a mid-70s Formula 1 car. Downforce? What is downforce? We don't need downforce where we're going. We've got big, slick tires, which actually aren't all that great by modern standards, but they're still not bad. We've got a manual gearbox. We've got heel-toe action going on. We've got double clutch action going on. It's a joy, it really is. No, it's nowhere near the ultimate performance potential of the modern cars or anything even remotely close, as of course we go off here. And that's the consequence of failure at the Nürburgring. We'll now have to carry this damage for quite a while. We're not going to pit yet, though, because I want to show you what happens. But before I went off, it was very nice to drive, and it actually still is kind of nice to drive, even though the steering's all askew now. It's incredible to consider that guys did this for 14 laps to do 300 kilometers around this absolutely crazy circuit. Let's not throw it off the road any more than that. Knowing that the consequence of failure is, at best case, this, and at worst case, well, we know what happens in the worst case scenario around here. The gearbox is very nice to use with my Thrustmaster TH8A shifter. Very nice. No complaints from me on that. Engine response, got about 500 horsepower like we mentioned, so it's really enough. You do get some decent straight line speed going on, even with the car crabbing like it is now. About 280 clicks, not too bad. We will be pitting and we will be repairing this damage and throwing some new tires on. Put a little bit more gas in the tank as well. I suppose we have the opportunity to show you the crazy pit entrance that is here at the current iteration of the Nordschleife. Of course, the racetrack as it would have been used in 1975, 1976 was a little bit longer than this because, well, what happened was they had the south loop of this track, which was known as the Südschleife, the south loop, and that was used as the start-finish straight as well as the pit lane. So you had that as the end of the lap. The pits were there, the paddock was there, and the lap began and ended there. The GP circuit as we know it today didn't exist yet, so the lap was a little bit longer, meaning that in terms of comparing lap times, it's a little bit more difficult to do nowadays because the circuit lengths are different, but you could do average speed comparisons. Pole position for the 1975 German Grand Prix here at the Nürburgring. Average speed was 196 kilometers an hour. My best lap here so far, and it's the one that you'll see later on at the end of this piece, average speed 184 kilometers an hour. Now that we've got all of our damages repaired, we can resume. And remember, the tires are cold again. Returning to what we were on about in terms of how the car feels. Well, as the tires are coming back up to temperature, it'll start to feel better for sure. But again, everything is pretty reasonable. There's nothing particularly difficult about it. The really difficult part about it is just making sure that you don't make a mistake around a circuit like this, of course, as we fell victim to. But everything is very progressive. I particularly enjoy just how the rear end likes to dance around a little bit. It will break free, you will get wheel spin, even in higher gears, if you have some slip angle dialed into the chassis. Like if I get on the throttle through here, you're going to get a little bit of wheel spin, little bit of opposite lock has to happen toward the exit. But it's all very controllable, provided that you catch it fast enough. Understeer, however, like we had midway through the previous lap, that is a lot more difficult. And when you've got a circuit like this, which has no margin for error, by the time you realize that the car's going away from you, it's already too late to compensate for it. Let's see, this corner's flat, this corner's not. A little bit of drifting for you through Calenard. Lots of engine braking now. Using the gearbox sequentially there to help us get slowed down. Of course, you don't have to, being an H pattern. But quite often it is the optimal way to get the thing stopped. Coming up to the Bergwerk corner. Again, this is where Niki had his accident, completely flat out when you're on the base. Gives you a sense of just how fast all of that happened. And again, I'm under no illusions here. This is nowhere near what this car really could do in the hands of somebody more competent, somebody more skilled than I. And I have to say, you don't see much of the Nordschleife on my channel, and there's a reason for that. Honestly, I'm not good enough for it. I never really liked this place. I was, even in the Gran Turismo days, in the Gran Turismo 4, when we got the Nordschleife available for the first time for many of us, I remember that we had several races in that game where we had to be on the Nordschleife. I always sent the B-Spec driver out. I never wanted to do it myself. I just wasn't good enough. I could never be consistent around here. It took me forever to learn this place, and I'm still learning it quite evidently. Just kind of pulls you in though, and you start to really hunker down, and your vision goes narrow, and you're just focused on the next apex and the next exit, knowing where you can and cannot use the curbing. Basically, a good rule of thumb for this place is stay away from the curbing as much as possible, because it's more like a wall. The curbing on most modern racetracks is something that you can use, it's something that you're supposed to use. Not here. If you hit it right, it'll push you back onto the circuit. If you hit it wrong, it'll bounce you into the wall. And if you hit it really wrong, it'll bounce you into the air. So again, don't use the curbing. But look at this with the Beloff S. Into fifth gear briefly, down into fourth. Playing with the throttle, third gear, second gear. Coming into the little carousel. Don't carry too much speed into the concrete because it'll just push you back out. Through Gallows Head, as it's called. And now the immense, long final straight here. It's amazing. This is an absolutely amazing place. Utterly terrifying. And it's hard to fathom that they did a Grand Prix here, not just once, but for several years. In the earlier days of Formula One. I can't even remember the last time that a modern Formula One car even drove the Nordschleife. I think Michael Schumacher was the last one to do it. He did it with a 2011 Mercedes, I think. Before that, I know Nick Heidfeld did it in 2007, I think it was, with 2006 BMW Sauber. But that's it in terms of modern Formula One exploration of the Nordschleife. It's just so prohibitive now. The cars are so low, they're so fast, the bumps around this place. This car soaks them up nicely just because of the way the suspension works. But the modern cars with the carbon suspension, it doesn't like to be pushed in too many different directions. The very small dampers that they have effectively zero deflection ability in terms of what they do to actually soak up the bumps. The cars more so just have to be set up as stiffly as possible for the aerodynamics. This place just doesn't work with the modern flavor of open wheeler. Down through the foxhole again. This might be my favorite section of the circuit. Not quite sure. There are so many great sections through here. And again, it's a recent acquisition in my skill set, even to be able to be somewhat quick around here. Lots and lots and lots of concentration going on right now. Huh. Oh, yes. The utter enormity of the place. The consequence of getting it wrong, it's just huge. And of course, to do it in a car like this, which really likes to go sideways, the brakes are just metaphors for, you know, something to make you feel better as you're careening toward the barrier. At least you got a great engine to listen to while you're setting your date with God. Brakes, second gear through the big carousel. It spit me out, a little bit too much speed through there. Oh well, that's a Caracciolo carousel. A little bit of AstroTurf on the outside there. It's basically the only place you have AstroTurf here. That's a little sideways coming over the blind crest. Brakes, more brakes, no brakes, second gear. More sideways. Again, the car likes to go sideways. I just don't like to go sideways. More sideways. And again, that was not a whole bunch of revs on the motor either. It just does that. It's the way the differential works. Oh, it's insanity. Yeah, get that thing stopped in a hurry. That was out of control. Keep it in third through here. Be a little bit careful. Shouldn't be able to come off of the throttle again. Yep. Got a little bit of understeer set in. And this is really the first time in the last 18 clicks or so that you've got the chance to breathe. Imagine doing this for 2 hours straight, fighting for position, thinking about, okay, when should I stop? Are the tires okay now? They might not be in another 20 clicks time. That's a 654, 184. That's about the most I think I can handle. Oh, man. It's utter insanity. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. But you can see the car is dirty. It's got all sorts of mud and crud that it's picked up. Nuts. Absolutely nuts. To drive this place, just one car on the circuit. Never mind trying to race here. Never mind doing it 14 times to do 300 clicks. Never mind fighting for position. Never mind dealing with changeable weather conditions. Never mind doing it for real. Holy God. To think that you had 20-something other drivers doing this at the same time as you, fighting with everything that they've got, trying to win the Grand Prix, and hoping that you don't die. It's nope, 100% nope, can't do it, not for me, sorry, try again some other day. But those guys did it, and in particular, this guy, whose name you see on the side of the bodywork there, did it. Niki Lauda, who of course we will remember now as being an absolute titan of not only Formula One, but a titan of life in general. There are a few things that this guy didn't get the chance to do in his lifetime. You could argue that perhaps 70 years is a little bit too short of a stint here on Earth. But for somebody who had to make a deal and say, all right, I'm done, 70, that's enough, I think you can say that Niki Lauda had quite an incredible story that he wrote during his time with us. And if any of us could aspire to achieve even a tenth of what this man did, forget his racing career, but just think of the mindset that he had. Think of the utter willpower, the independence, the complete self-reliance and self-confidence that this man had to achieve the things that he did, to take the sorts of risks that he did, and to enjoy the successes that he enjoyed, knowing that at the end of the day, it was his own hard work and his own common sense that he had owed to all of that. He reaped the benefits of his own drive, his own commitment, and there it was. He was a man of relatively few words. He never liked to tell people what they wanted to hear. He told them what they needed to hear. Brutally honest all the time. All of the interviews that I've seen with him, he doesn't sugarcoat anything. He tells it like he sees it, and you know what? If you don't like it, that's your problem. Have a nice day. That's who he was. Niki Lauda, 3 times world champion, 1975, 1977, and 1984. 2 with Ferrari, 1 with McLaren. That's his second stint of a Formula One career as well, returning with McLaren and becoming world champion again. He's a figure that we don't see too often. I venture to say that we won't see another person of the likes of Niki Lauda within all of our lifetimes. But we're privileged in the sense that even though we observe this sport and observe these people from afar, we have incredible resources today, incredible opportunities that technology affords us to be able to look back into the past and to see what people like him did in their glory days, and also to hear them in their own words and to learn a little bit about what made them tick and to take inspiration from that and to say, you know what, Niki Lauda is pretty cool. Is there any way that I could apply what he could teach us in my own life? I don't know. Food for thought for all of you. But of course, we salute Niki Lauda. We thank him for the contributions that he made, not only to motorsport, but in terms of giving us all a little bit of cannon fodder for our brains in terms of looking at what we're not doing right with our lives. And perhaps we can emulate a little bit of that Lauda charisma and that common sense fortitude in our own day-to-day existences. I leave you with that thought, and I leave you with a look at a couple of hot laps that I did manage to string together in this car around the Nordschleife, going a little bit faster, but not all that much faster, I must say, than what we've just managed to do here today. I thank you all very, very much for watching, and of course, I salute you, Niki Lauda. Thank you very much, and Godspeed. Until next time, stay tuned for the hot laps. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.